Shades of Green is one of the few unique resorts on Walt Disney World property that share the distinction of not actually being owned or operated by Disney themselves. However, this resort isn't owned by Hilton or Sheraton or the Four Seasons. No, this resort is owned by the United States Department of Defense, and it exists thanks to some perfect conditions and a pretty smart business deal. Now, Shades of Green is technically 24 years old, but in a way, it's actually much older than that. In fact, it's been around almost as long as Disney World itself. Back in 1971, when Disney World first opened, it offered up two golf courses called the Palm and the Magnolia. They were right next to each other, so Disney built a clubhouse for both courses right in between the two. 2 years later, in 1973, while scrambling to add more rooms to their property due to Disney World's popularity, Disney decided to convert the clubhouse into a resort by adding over 150 guest rooms. When it came time to theme and name the resort, Disney, the company behind some of the most beloved and memorable creative works of the last 100 years, settled on the Golf Resort. Over the following 13 years, the resort struggled. It was a Disney-owned and operated hotel, but it was kind of an odd man out. Not too far away, you had the Polynesian and Contemporary hotels. One had a beautiful and immersive Polynesian setting on the water, the other had a novel, massive, and modern atrium, and both were connected to the Magic Kingdom and later Epcot via monorail. Then, across the road, you had the Golf Resort. It featured golf. As a result, the Golf Resort saw average occupancy rates of 60 to 75%. Now, compared to other hotels in the Central Florida area, that actually wasn't too bad, but right across the street, the Polynesian and Contemporary were almost constantly in the high 90% range. As shocking as it might sound, the Golf Resort wasn't seen by many as a Disney hotel. So in 1986, they decided to do something about it. Not Disney enough, eh? Alright, we'll make it more Disney. We're gonna change the name to the Disney Inn. How's that for Disney? Theme? Snow White. Short of an actual Mickey Mouse hotel, which Eisner did consider, you can't really get more Disney than that. Here's the catch though. By this point, Michael Eisner and Frank Wells were now running Disney, and part of their goal at Disney World was to expand the hotel offerings. So while the Golf Resort was given a second life as the Disney Inn, just 2 years later it would be dwarfed by the Grand Floridian and joined by the Caribbean Beach Resort. The few years after that would bring us the Yacht Club, the Beach Club, Port Orleans, Old Key West, and Dixie Landings. They were hotels designed as hotels, and all memorable in one way or another. The Disney Inn was just a clubhouse turned hotel that never really found its stride. Now, around this time is when the Department of Defense was starting to consider a new resort. At this point, they already had 3. They were called AFRCs, which stood for Armed Forces Recreation Center. They were affordable and self-sustaining resorts where members of the armed forces could go or take their families on vacation. They had one in Germany, one in South Korea, and one in Hawaii. However, with the Gulf War recently coming to a close, more and more service members were returning home to the States, and so the DoD decided they wanted a resort on the US mainland. This was the early 1990s, and between Disney World, the beaches, and the recently opened Universal Studios Orlando, Central Florida would make for a perfect location. Initially, over 40 hotels and motels expressed interest in being the location of choice for the DoD, and that included Disney and the Disney Inn. Now, if we think about this for a moment, it was a brilliant move on Disney's part. By offering up the Disney Inn, they were offloading this hotel that was never really intended to be a hotel to begin with, and were trading in subpar occupancy rates for a dependable payday. But perhaps more importantly, they would be striking a blow against their competition. Like I said, Universal Studios had just recently opened, so by getting the Department of Defense to put their 4th AFRC smack dab in the middle of their property, they were ensuring that nearly all of the service members visiting would be spending money at Disney World. Ultimately, the DoD did go with Disney, and cited that it was the quality of their rooms and the proximity to the parks that won them over. In November of 1993, they announced a deal in which they would sign a 100-year lease on the hotel and the land it sat on. Just 3 months later, on February 1st, 1994, the hotel would reopen as Shades of Green. To keep the hotel affordable to service members, the rates were lowered. While an average night at the Disney Inn ran between $180 and $215 a night, a stay at Shades of Green, depending on your rank, ran between $49 and $92 a night. In other words, any occupancy problems the hotel faced were now a thing of the past. Within the first month as Shades of Green, occupancy jumped to 98%, and the hotel would remain fully booked for the first 8 months of operation. However, the resort still ran into financial problems. You see, like I mentioned, the room prices were based on rank. Privates would only pay the $49, while the highest ranking officers would pay the top end $92. So it was no surprise that the majority of guests at the hotel that year were lower ranked members and paying lower rates as a result. It hurt the hotel's bottom line, and it put them $1 million into the red by the end of their first year. Oddly enough, one of the proposed solutions to this problem, beyond just raising the room rates, was to just outright purchase the hotel. They'd be investing more in the short term, but the year-to-year costs would lower without the hotel lease and with a renegotiated land lease. And then they'd own a hotel that would hopefully appreciate in value over time. So in 1996, that's just what they did, and for the price of $43 million, the Department of Defense purchased Shades of Green. Today, Shades of Green is still around, and despite being owned by the government, it still offers some of the perks of a Disney-owned resort. Guests staying there can enjoy extra magic hours, book fast passes up to 60 days before their stay, and enjoy complimentary bus transportation. It's an interesting case of all the right events lining up just around the right time. And it was one of the multiple examples we would see of Disney's new leadership finding creative ways to get people to stay on Disney property. But if there's one note to end on when it comes to the history of this unique and interesting hotel, it's really Disney? The golf resort?